a stronger economy should be guided by a simple fact. Women are today and can continue to be the primary drivers of our nation's economic growth. So an economy that delivers for women will be an economy that delivers for all. And to drive home that point today, we have a fantastic program. You'll hear from leading economists in the White House, federal and state policymakers, and organizational leaders and partners. And to kick us off, over the last couple of years, few states have made more progress than Minnesota in advancing an economic agenda that centers women. And so I'm thrilled to kick us off with a conversation between Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan and CAP's Vice President for Government Affairs, Laura Rodriguez. Thank you all, and welcome to today.
Thank you so much, Naveen. That was a great introduction to what I think is going to be an excellent conversation. And for those of you who don't know a lot about Minnesota, I think after you hear from Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, you'll get a pretty good idea as to why this is one of our favorite places in the country. So first of all, I just want to thank you for being here, for your leadership in the state. As Naveen just alluded to, last year was one of Minnesota's most productive legislative sessions. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to hear a little bit from you about what your biggest priorities were for last year and what you're looking to do in the coming one.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Buju, Peggy Flanagan, Indigenous Kaz, Gijuewa Damokwe, Indigo, Gawabaga, Ganikagnan Dunjaba, Mangan Nudodame. My name is Peggy Flanagan. My Ojibwe name is Speaks with a Loud and Clear Voice Woman. I'm a member of the White Earth Nation, and my family's the Wolf Clan. And I'm so happy to be here with you at CAP. Thank you so much for the invitation. And one of my favorite things to say is don't sleep on LGs. So thank you for helping to lift up the platform of lieutenant governors. Many of us are policy nerds on the inside and are getting it done. So in 2023, we really had the opportunity to just run as hard and as fast as we could. And we try to take advantage of that. So things like paid family and medical leave, the largest investment ever in childcare, our child tax credit, which I will absolutely nerd out and talk about more, making sure that kids got free breakfast and lunch at school, no questions asked, and of course, protecting access to abortion and reproductive health care. Those are our priorities. We got them done. And I think, you know, a decade earlier, we had a trifecta with the DFL. We have the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota in the House and Senate and governor's office. And I think many of those who had lived through that as advocates, like myself, you know, just said there were some missed opportunities there. We're not going to miss opportunities this time around. And so brought together a lot of folks who were in coalition together. And because we had refined policies, we had worked on them together, we were just ready to go. And we had a very strong inside-outside game, which allowed us to move them.
That's amazing. And I think we need to maybe have you go on tour in other states to teach some of this. I'm curious, how much did empowering women center in the full agenda, your economic agenda for 2023?
It's kind of the whole thing, right? I mean, so I think about when we talk about the advocates and the decision makers working together, many of the people previously who had been doing this organizing work to move these policies, then eventually got elected. And so like, that's also part of it, making sure that we are the decision makers, that we are in the room where it happens, but also knowing that there are organizations that have been led by women who have advised, shaped this policy, and then helped us to bring the stories of women who are directly affected into these spaces. And I think so much of this work, you know, we're a CAP, and so you all do the research, and I love it. And we make sure that we then also have the narrative and the stories that are attached to it that I think are so incredibly important. So women-led organizations, but also we just saw this movement in 2022 of women who just showed up to vote, to protect their rights. And I think it was clearly an opportunity to then just sweep in when it came to policymaking as well, that it doesn't, democracy doesn't just stop right at the ballot box. We have to make sure that we're advocating and in relationship with our electeds to get it done.
I just want to highlight the first piece that you said, which is all of it, all of the agenda, because as we're going to be talking about most of this event, when women are successful in the economy, so is the economy, period. So thank you for that. I wanted to give you a minute to expand a little bit on the success of the paid family and medical leave. I know you've been an advocate, excuse me, for years on this, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about what that really means for women in Minnesota now that that's passed.
Sure. So I am the recovering executive director of Children's Defense Fund Minnesota, and was one of the founders of Minnesotans for Paid Family and Medical Leave, and literally would bring my baby to meetings. My kid has gone to a lot of meetings, but would bring my baby to meetings as we were talking about the need for paid family and medical leave. She is now 11. And so I share that with you because I think it matters as we talk about doing this work, about laying the groundwork, ensuring that we don't give up, right? We kept the faith, we kept moving forward, and kept bringing new people into this coalition with us. So for paid family and medical leave, we have one of the most generous programs in the country. It's for parental leave as well as medical leave. You can take up to 12 weeks for both of those things, and with 20 weeks total. And I think, what we know this means to women and their families is they don't have to choose between a paycheck, right, and taking care of a new baby or a new child. And they don't have to choose between caring for themselves or a loved one and a paycheck. And as you know, women are caregivers, right? And so we experience the largest impact when we have to pause, right, to care financially. So I'm excited for what this means. We are now deep in the weeds of implementation. So we have to make sure that we get it right, because I want other states to be able to look to Minnesota and say, this is the sort of gold standard of how we should be implementing these policies. And if we need to go state by state to get it, that's what we'll do. But I am eager to make sure that we have a federal policy too.
Get that trifecta up here too.
That's right.
Wonderful. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. You also mentioned in one of your policy wins of 2023 was the protection of reproductive health and rights for women. So obviously we all know about the recent IVF ruling in Alabama and the absolute mess that caused, and fear really for so many women. One of the accomplishments I've heard you talk about is about passing the Protect Reproductive Options Act, or the PRO Act. And excuse me, that doesn't just codify the abortion rights, of course, but it's about contraception and fertility, sterilization, all care. And as we know, reproductive health care is healthcare. So I'm curious what you think about the impact of that legislation would be for women in the coming years if we're able to get that done.
For sure. So the day that we found out that Roe fell, we were literally filming a campaign commercial. And I was like, I gotta take a minute. And I called my mom. And my mom said in a very clear and stern voice, "Well, I've prepared you your whole life for this moment." And I was like, yes, right. So, and it was that sort of mom energy that I needed for the fuel for the rest of the campaign. But then as we got to work, We actually, I lost my mom about 2 weeks after the election. Thank you. But she knew that we won. She knew that we had a progressive majority, and knew that we needed to get to work. So I thought about her the whole time we were working on these policies. And the day that the governor signed the PRO Act into law, my daughter was standing right next to him. And that mattered to me because I need to make sure that she also is prepared for what is in front of her. So what this means is that women have access to abortion, contraception. Of course, as we're talking about IVF, we put those protections in. It means that for Minnesota, we're in a really good place. And it means we're an island of access and decency in the upper Midwest. But what it also means is that we have to work our tails off to ensure that we are protecting it. And that means also winning elections with people, right, who support reproductive health care. We are one election away from a national abortion ban, and we have to talk about it. It actually doesn't matter what protections we put in Minnesota if this passes. And so I want us to be really clear, and I also want us to be able to say the word abortion. It's not a big deal, right? Like, it is healthcare. We need to be comfortable with it. There is no shame in it. And so as much as possible, when we can just say that word, I think it removes a lot of stigma and allows us to have the kind of conversations that are needed and necessary to continue this movement, right? We are just in the infancy of what it takes to protect our rights.
Thank you. Yeah, please. I'm going to seize on your mom energy because a lot of us know what that's about, and we just, we forge ahead and we take all of that and do it for our children, if nothing else, for very selfish reasons in many ways. So, as a mother of a young daughter, what does your perfect economy for her look like?
Well, I can tell you when I found out I was pregnant with her and then that she was a girl, I cried. And it was a moment of, oh my gosh, she's going to make, 63 cents on the dollar. And I immediately went into a spiral of she'll date an artist in high school who will break her heart. And I was like, no, that was you. Right. Like, so I think it's dealing with our own stuff, right? Like, as we're moms, but also this is like little things, right? Like, I watched my daughter walk down the street, and when someone was, about to walk into her, I watched her say, "I'm sorry." Oof. And so I was like, wow, it was a real lesson for me. And we have now had active conversations. And it's like, you can say, "Excuse me." I was like, but you do not have to apologize for taking up space. And so, as we're having conversations about what the economy looks like, everywhere she goes, I don't want her to have to apologize for who she is, right? To confidently bring her expertise and her experience into the room, to be able to just really name what it is that she delivers in whatever career she decides to have. Right now, she wants to be a teacher, which I think is wonderful. And we have to make sure that for that economy, the teachers are compensated, are paid well for the incredible work that they do. And then we're also thinking about the kind of future that we're going to leave our young people. And we're talking about climate justice, and that we're talking about our relatives who are experiencing homelessness. And so, the whole way that the governor and I approach policymaking is that children don't come in pieces. And so we have to make sure that we're looking at, right, education, the environment, transportation, childcare, access to healthcare, that all these things work together. So for my daughter, I want her, one, to take advantage of the pay equity bill that we passed that does not allow her, future employer to ask about her previous income. And I want to make sure that we have more of a level playing fields in general when it comes to the economy overall. I'm going to make sure that, like, I continue to work on that. And there's things that we can do system-wide, but also just as a mom at home, I'm going to make sure that she knows who she is every time she walks into a room and can do so confidently.
Amazing. My 5-year-old doesn't say sorry for anything. Um, but it happens in time, right? It's weird learned behaviors. She wants to be a ballerina dancing astronaut, and I'm all for it.
Wait a minute. Hold on. This is an important point. Growing up, I wanted to be a ballerina nurse, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is delivering healthcare, dancing from room to room. So
It's amazing.
hold on to that dream. Okay.
Oh,
All right. Yep.
I fully support.
I love
fully
it. I
support.
love it.
But as you're telling that story, I think what really comes through in everything that you are doing, have done, and are continuing to push for is who you are. You bring who you are into everything that you do. And that's so important. Having people with your background, your experience in the room is huge. It's a huge win for everyone.
Thank you.
And so I just wanted to name that and thank you for that, because it's so clear to me that you are infusing that into everything that you do. And on that, you are the highest ranking Native executive elected official, which, congratulations. Yeah. My question for you on this is, how do you center your work to make the progress for those communities of color that have been so underrepresented for so long?
Sure. And I will just correct the record briefly, which is I'm the highest ranking Native woman elected to office. There is Governor Stitt. That's all I'll say about that. I will say at no point can I stop being an Anishinaabe Kwe. It's not a hat that I can take on, right, and put on and take off. I bring, and I have to, right, my entire identity into these places, because for so long, especially as a Native woman, we have entire systems and structures that were created, right, to silence us, to eliminate us in many ways. Like, I shouldn't even be here. And so when we talk about these systems and structures, we have to be on the inside. And my dad always said, he was like, my girl, I want to burn the system down and you want to fix it from the inside out. And like, we literally need both, right? We need both. We need to change the systems that no longer serve us and build something that works for us. But the only way you can do that, right, is if you're at the table. So before I was a lieutenant governor, did a lot of organizing work in communities of color and in Native communities, making sure that when we were moving policies, they were directly informed. There's something small, but that has a big impact, for example, is called the Community Solutions Fund, which came out of the work I did at Children's Defense Fund, where we had grant dollars and resources from the state of Minnesota that were then put into a pot. The communities of color led organizations then determined what would happen with those funds. It was research-based. It was also, again, we're experts in our own communities, and so we should bring the solutions. And the one thing that I will say, it is no accident that in this past legislative session in 2023, in 2022, we elected the most diverse legislature ever, bringing 3 Black women for the first time to the Minnesota Senate. And now we have Native people in the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, Native women and non-binary folks. And so that matters. It matters that we can talk about our own experience. It matters that people feel as though they are being brought into the room with us. And we just get better results. And I think if you're not going to invite us in out of the goodness of your heart, which you should, but if that's not going to be the case, you should look at the kind of results that we get when we are at the table and able to craft our own policies and destiny.
What an incredible pleasure. I think we could talk to you for about another 2 hours at minimum. It's been so fun to talk to you, but I want to open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions.
Good morning, Mark Lerner. After reading about the formation of charter schools in Minnesota, were you able to accomplish what you were able to because in Minnesota you have a tradition of nonpartisan legislatures?
In the growing of charter schools? Well, it certainly was a movement, right, that started in the mid-90s in Minnesota. I think we're in an interesting moment where I think there are things that have been of great value, like making sure that we have schools and curriculum that reflects the student population, that there are teachers that are being grown from communities of color. And I think that matters. And there's been, I think, family engagement and community engagement that has happened around charter schools in a way that doesn't always happen in public education. But I also think that we're looking at the results of some schools as well, and that aren't necessarily meeting the mark. So I would say it is a mixed bag. And the thing that we need to make sure that we're focusing on, regardless, we have a incredible school choice, right, in Minnesota. And I mean, between, public schools, magnet schools, that our families have a lot of choice. But I also think that we need to make sure that no matter where a child attends, that they have an opportunity to succeed. And I think many of these schools haven't met their full promise in the way that they have been intended to. So ensuring that our schools are fully funded, that our teachers are paid well, and that they're retained and see that there's a future for themselves. I think many of the policies that we just talked about are a way for us to get there, but we haven't fully realized, I think, the potential of public education in Minnesota, and we're on our way. But there's certainly more work to do. So it's a mixed bag.
Hi, I'm Julie Cashton from the Century Foundation. I've been following with a lot of excitement what Minnesota's done on childcare and would love to hear you talk about that. And if you also feel like it, because I've loved hearing your personal stories too, would love to hear how you handle childcare with your daughter and what you're excited for Minnesota.
For
Thanks.
sure. So childcare is my jam. I'm so glad that you brought it up. I love it. And what's been really incredible has been the work that we've been able to do in ensuring that for the child care assistance program, which my mom relied on back in the day, is reimbursing folks at a higher rate. So we increased reimbursement rates to the 75th percentile. That literally is something that we've been working on for 9 years. So it was very exciting, as well as we were very intentional about making sure that childcare providers were able to be kept whole as much as possible through the pandemic. That was incredibly important. And we also introduce resources so that childcare workers themselves can be paid better. It's an incredibly important role, and we don't talk about it in the way that we need to. Glenda, who was our in-home childcare provider, was our partner, right, in raising Siobhan. She really was. And then we got to preschool and had an incredible experience there. And that needs to be accessible to everybody. And that's certainly what we're working on to make sure that folks have access to a mixed delivery system so that they can choose the childcare preschool option, early education option that's right for them. We have been fortunate to have folks like Senator Smith from Minnesota, who's been a champion on this. I know you'll hear from her soon. But the opportunity is when Senator Smith is able to realize, right, her vision of childcare, and we have implemented what we have implemented, that families will not have to pay college tuition, right, to simply have their child be cared for. For us, I will tell you, the largest raise I ever received was when my child started kindergarten. All-day kindergarten, that matters, and was part of the Dayton Smith administration before us. But I'll also say that, it has been, we've been really fortunate to be able to have access in a way that I would not be able to have this job in the way that I do and be able to show up in the way that I do without really incredible childcare. But I also say this, when I told you I brought my baby to a lot of meetings, my kid goes to a lot of meetings, and folks say like, gosh, that is so nice that you just expose her to so many things. You bring her everywhere with you. And I'm like, thank you. And we don't have a choice, right? And so she's been in a lot of committee hearings, a lot of floor sessions. Auntie Tina, right, came to her school play because she hangs out with United States senators because that is the necessity, right, in her world. But it also should just be like, in addition to making sure we have a robust and fully funded childcare system, we also need to make sure that we are creating spaces where if you want to bring your kid to a meeting, it's no big deal, right? Being in the Native community, when I would travel all across the country in Indian country, I brought my daughter with me everywhere, to meetings, to trainings. It's just kind of what you do. And if we create spaces and systems like that beyond policy, imagine what could be possible. Thanks for that question.
I think we have time for one more.
Good. Hi, Joan Michelson. I have Electric Ladies podcast. I've had Heather on my show, actually, who you'll hear from shortly. Climate change might be a good thing in Minnesota. Having spent many winters there, I'm sure you like the fact that it's a little bit warmer these days and a little less snow. But you mentioned climate justice. Where does climate change fit in the priorities of Minnesota voters these days? You've talked about education, you've talked about childcare, you've talked about reproductive rights and abortion, but where does the climate crisis fit into that scenario, into the values of the voters in Minnesota?
So I'd say, first of all, while it has been nice to be able to not grab a jacket as I walk out the door, it has also been horrifying. We've had snow on the ground, I don't know, maybe a couple weeks. That's unheard of. And so, of course, it's El Nino, et cetera, but we literally just announced grants from the Small Business Administration because we, have the drought, right, assistance that was available previously, because there are businesses who rely on snow, of course, and have literally seen anywhere between a 30 to 80% reduction, right, in business this year. That is not sustainable. So it's nice, but also like there's just this ominous vibe in the air all of the time because we see the kind of future, right, that our children will be facing. And so I would say, again, in the same way that, children don't come in pieces, we have to make sure that this is part of our overall plan. So we passed clean energy by 2040 in Minnesota, which took a long time to do, and we had to be very intentional about it. But we are well on our way. I think in Minnesota, we're certainly doing more and doing what we need to do. But I think we also have to have the conversation that it's not just about individual choices, right? It's about corporations, right? Determining that, this is, in order to have a sustainable future, they have to be part of it. And so we're working in partnership with many of them, but like for some, we may need to, push them harder to make sure that we have the kind of future that we need. But honestly, I think about it all the time. I think young people think about it all the time. I think she just asked your voters. It depends. And so I think that is where we are being pushed by young people to say, like, you need to leave us with a future. And one of the reasons we live in Minnesota, it is a beautiful place, is because of the state parks, the environment, the lakes, the beauty. it is slipping away from us, and we have to be intentional. So that was part of when we said running as hard and as fast as we can. That also meant in climate policy. And when I talk about climate justice, it is that communities of color, Native communities, immigrant communities are the folks who've been most impacted, right, by the injustice of what we see and health outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So we've made sure that we also are talking about disparate impacts in communities as we are moving climate policy forward that is centered in the work that we do. And we have to make sure that we're doing as much as possible over the next, during our term, so that that is built in, so that it's harder for another administration or legislature to undo. It simply becomes how we do the work.
Thank you so much. Once again, it's been an incredible pleasure to have you here. We really would love to just have you back as much as you'd like. So please do let us know when you're back. So thank you again for this incredible conversation. And it's clear, I think you all are going to see with our next speaker that Minnesota really has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to women, incredible women in power. So I see back there, I want to welcome to the stage Senator Tina Smith from combating maternal mortality rates to standing alongside union leaders, fighting for seniors. Senator Smith has been an incredible champion for empowering women throughout her career. She's a fighter for equality and also happens to be one of Cap's favorite Hill friends. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Senator Tina Smith.
Myself settled her. Hey, sister.
I won't be lieutenant governor without Senator.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those in the room and good morning to those of you who are sitting at your kitchen table or your desk or wherever you may be. And a huge thank you to Center for American Progress, to Navin and Patrick and Laura and Joe and everybody for putting together this incredible event and for inviting me to help celebrate the launch of the Playbook for Advancing Women in the Economy. Did you all enjoy knowing Peggy Flanagan a little bit? Peggy and I have been friends and co-conspirators for many, many years. And so it's just such a joy for me to be able to be here in the same space as you are and to talk about these really important topics. And I also want you to know you are in for such a treat in a minute when you hear from Heather Boucher, who I am a total fangirl for Heather Boucher and the work that she has done to really look at what is unlocked if we get at the fundamental structural issues of inequality in our economy. And so it's perfect that Heather is here today. And I think very apt as we talk about what we're going to talk about today. So I think everybody in this room, everybody in this space really starts from the same place, which is that our economy will not work if it doesn't work for women. As sociologist Jessica Carlacco said, pardon me for mangling that for a sec, she has observed other countries have safety nets, the United States has women. And I think that we can agree that we need economic and social policy that supports women because these are the policies that are going to support families and communities. These are the policies that are going to make it so that we can realize our core value that everybody in this country has the freedom and opportunity to build the lives that they choose, that they want, including women. And I think that that is what this CAP playbook that we're celebrating the launch of today is really all about. And I mean, I know a little of what I speak about this. So picture this. I'm a mom in my mid-30s. My husband, Archie, is traveling for business. I've got two little boys, Sam and Mason. They are adorable. They are curious. They are cunning. They are playful and occasionally completely unmanageable. I'm running a consulting business out of our upstairs bedroom, and I've got clients and projects that I am trying to juggle. And I'm at the same time trying to project that I have it all together when I have breakfast on my shirt. Luckily, this was before Zoom. I'm writing reports while at the same time I'm hoping that the kids stay napping. and I'm frantically loading them into their car seats so that I can drive down the street and fax at mailboxes, et cetera. Now, I know nobody faxes anymore, but it was like the only way I could make my business work back then. So think about that. And I think about that. I mean, I'm now 66. And what I am thinking about is how the more things change, the more things stay the same. I mean, this is pretty much the situation for so many working mothers. And most mothers are working mothers. We are juggling an incredible amount of stuff. We're juggling children and jobs and our parents and caregiving. In our economy, we know that women are making less money and women of color are making a lot less money. And so here's the thing. I mean, this isn't an accident. This is a design flaw. This was planned this way. I think we understand that, I mean, men in power designed our system this way so that, I mean, the load goes on women, and especially women of color. And we are still carrying that load. And now it is our job to design a different system, a system that supports women. And that is what this CAP roadmap is all about, because it does not have to work this way. And until we fix it, our economy in this country is always going to be running at sort of half speed. So let me just take one piece of this puzzle in the few minutes that I have with you, and let's explore what that means. Let's talk about childcare. I was so glad to hear Peggy, who's been such a champion and an organizer for childcare in Minnesota, talk a little bit about what we have been able to accomplish in Minnesota. And we have made progress in Minnesota, and we also have so much more work to do. So think about childcare from the perspective of parents, because from the perspective of parents, childcare in this country, it's kind of a mess. I hear from Minnesotans who live in small towns and rural places in Minnesota that are driving more than 50 miles to get their child to a place where they can be during the day. If they have two children, they might be driving in two different directions because there aren't enough spots in one childcare center. And in Minnesota, and Minnesota is very similar to most places around this country, if you have two kids in childcare, it costs an average of $12,000 a piece for them. Now, that means you're spending $24,000 a year, after taxes, which means that, I mean, even before taxes, you're spending roughly a third of your income just on childcare. Think about what Peggy was saying about the big raise that you get when you get your child into all-day kindergarten in Minnesota. But I mean, meanwhile, this is what parents are dealing with. And I mean, to be clear, parents haven't had decades to save money for paying for that. You cannot put your baby in a work-study program so that they can help, earn part of the cost. There aren't Pell Grants for little kids in childcare centers, though, I mean, we are making some headway with childcare assistance. And think about the other side of this problem. If you are a childcare provider, it is not working for you either. Childcare centers are struggling to find staff. As we all know, a national survey found that over half of childcare centers are short-staffed. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, because staff at these centers are making so little. You can do better working at Walmart than you can working in a childcare center. The median wage for a childcare worker in this country is a little over $13 an hour. So that is not enough to support the family that you are trying to raise at the same time. And of course, most of these childcare workers are women and women of color. So our childcare system is broken. It is not working for parents, and it is not working for the amazing people who want their jobs to be taking care of our little babies. But here's the thing, we can fix it. It does not have to be this way. We don't expect parents of kids in third grade in this country to pay full tuition for their students. And because we understand that we have a public interest in making sure that every third grader gets educated. And so it should be for childcare, as it is in most every other industrialized country in the world. So what do? There are ways that we can fix it, and I am working with people in the Senate to try to make it work. Especially, I'm working with my colleagues, Elizabeth Warren and Patty Murray, and also Senator Bob Casey and other colleagues, to reform our childcare system so that every family who needs it and wants it has access to high-quality, affordable childcare. Our legislation would make it so that millions of Americans could get great childcare for no more than $10 a day. Now, that would work for American families. We would boost wages for childcare workers so that they're comparable to what public school teachers make. Not that public school teachers make enough. They need to make more. And we would help also childcare centers be able to provide lunches so that they can afford really good, healthy food for their babies. And you know what? I don't want to even hear from anybody who tells us that we cannot afford to do this, because we cannot afford not to do this. And I've got a billionaire tax to talk to you about if you want to figure out how we can find a pay for. So these are our kids. These are passionate, creative, determined moms. These are women who are the economic engines of their families and their communities and their states and our country. And we cannot expect them to carry this load. The cost of that is just too high. So I am so grateful to CAP for giving all of us this roadmap for how we can redesign a system that puts women and children first, not last. Because when women have the freedom, when we have the opportunity to build the lives that we want with childcare, with paid family and medical leave, with equity in employment and wages, and with full access to healthcare, including the freedom to decide for ourselves without political interference about birth control and IVF and abortion. When we have all of that, then we all will do better. Every one of us will do better, and our country will do better. So thank you so much to CAP and to all of you for your work, for your organizing, for your attention to these matters. I am so grateful to be a part of this effort, and you can count me in.
Pay Day, a day to raise awareness on the gender wage gap for the ratio of women to men's median annual earnings. Let's go over 5 facts the data shows us. In 2022, the gender wage gap was the lowest on record, but there's still progress to be made. Women earned just 84 cents for every dollar that men earned. Women of all ages experience the gender wage gap, and it widens over women's career. Older women earn just 78 cents for every dollar older men earn. Black and Hispanic women experience even larger wage gaps when compared with white, non-Hispanic men. Black women earn just 65 cents on the dollar. Hispanic women earn just 57 cents on the dollar. Earnings losses due to the gender wage gap compound over a woman's lifetime. Assuming the gender wage gap remains constant, women may lose up to $400,000 over a 40-year career. Women are also more likely than men to earn low wages. For example, women are more likely to earn under $30,000 a year, which is about the poverty line for a family of 4. Together, we can fight to close the gender wage gap. Sign our letter to tell Congress to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Emily G., and I'm Senior Vice President for Inclusive Growth here at the Center for American Progress. I'm so lucky today to be joined by one of my favorite economists, Heather Boushey. Heather is a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and also the chief economist for the President's Invest in America cabinet. She was previously president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which she also co-founded. She's had a number of important roles around town as an economist, including as chief economist for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential transition team. She also served as an economist at the Joint Economic Committee, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and the Economic Policy Institute. And we are so proud to also consider Heather an alum here at Center for American Progress. Heather, welcome back. We're so glad to have you with us today.
I am thrilled to be here in this beautiful new space that CAP has. It's so wonderful to be back here with everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'd like to kick us off with your reflections on this new playbook that we launched this morning, the Playbook for the Advancement of Women in the Economy. A central thesis of both our examination of the problems as well as the solutions that we present for both the federal and state level is that investing in women's well-being is an investment in all of us. I know this is a notion that you've advanced throughout your career and through your research. So can you tell us, how are women integral to broader economic growth? And what do we all miss out on when policy fails to acknowledge that?
It's a great question. It's a big question. So let me just start by noting that one of the things that the senator ended on that I think a tagline that folks had a number of years ago was that when women succeed, America succeeds. And I think that that is such an important tagline for how we should think about the economic implications. We know that when people are allowed to enter the economy, do whatever it is that they want to do, find their best fit, find the best job that they can do, or start a business, or whatever it is that they can add productively, that adds to our overall economic growth and stability. And there's actually research evidence on this. There's a paper that I've quoted many times over the years that looked at how much the economy gained after the Civil Rights Act, when occupations were opened up to women and minorities all across the country. And you saw this uptick in economic growth. It accounts for about a fifth of economic growth over many decades after the Civil Rights Act, is that that acknowledgement that everybody has talents and something to give. And if we just open up that space, then everybody can do that. But here's the other thing. We need to make sure that women and that everyone is empowered to fully participate in the economy. So we know that when we provide childcare, we provide paid leave, when we make sure that we've long known that investing in education and health, that all of these things help people participate. It helps them have the skills that they need and make sure that they are healthy and able to fully participate in the labor market, and make sure that all of the care sides of the economy are being taken care of. And we know that there are effects on family well-being. This improves economic outcomes for families. In a book that I wrote a number of years ago, based on a lot of work that I did here at the Center for American Progress, we looked at all the different ways that women's incomes have added to family economic well-being. And just acknowledging that without those incomes, the income and the added hours and earnings of women, family income might have fallen in recent decades because it's so important, right? So it's important that women have those opportunities. It's important that we have those supports, and this affects family economic well-being, and that all affects overall economic growth in our economy and society. It just can't be underestimated. And we'll end on just this note. When you think about growth in the aggregate, it's based on how many people are participating in your economy and what their skills are. This is very, very basic bread and butter Econ 101 kind of stuff. And yet we have to make those investments in people and communities and women and in care to empower women all across the country.
Thank you. And one of the things that you and your colleagues at the Council of Economic Advisors have documented is that 2023 was a year that really defied expectations, and women were a big part of that. A couple of the highlights include the fact that the gender pay gap was among the narrowest that it's ever been. We also saw record high employment rates for women of prime age in the workforce, that's ages 25 to 54. And then if you go back and look at the clips and the headlines from last summer, you see some names that should be familiar to you all, like Beyonce and Taylor Swift and Barbie, and women really were driving the economic narratives. So what would you say were the drivers of that success that we saw in 2023 and the upswing that we're in? And what were women's contribution to those successes?
Well, there's a couple of things I would point to, and let me just zoom out for a moment and go big. Right? When the president came into office, we were facing a series of economic crises. We had the pandemic that was raging across the country. And even if you had a job where you could telecommute from home, you still had care challenges. Millions of American families did, both men and women. And you had the ensuing recession that led to job losses. And then so many, especially service sector jobs were, just they weren't happening because they were face to face. So you had all of this that we had to recover from. On top of the long-standing challenges of economic inequality, of climate change, and as we had been learning, it became so visceral, the fragility of our supply chains, which had been fragile for a long time, but we didn't really know it until the pandemic, or we didn't acknowledge it. And so the very first thing that the president focused on when he came into office was a series of, day one announcements. Particularly, I wanted to elevate for this group the day one executive order around equity that was about racial equity. It was about equity across place, but it was also about gender equity. And then very quickly moving towards the American Rescue Plan that got people back into the economy, got them back to work. And one of the things that we did that was so important is we made a significant, one might say ginormous, but very significant investment in care. We put all of this money out there for childcare centers all across the country to be able to tap into. And I had to torment the junior staff at CA. Torment is a strong word, but I had to ask the junior staff at CA to rerun a chart that one of our just dearly departed economists used to do, looking at the factors that affect who's in the labor force over time. And we've been tracking this really from day one at the Council of Economic Advisors, what the role of different factors was in keeping people out of the labor force. And, after we did the American Rescue Plan, we got the economy back on track. Care stopped being something that was hindering people, and it started being a little bit of a bump up because people had that support around the country. It helped women, it helped moms get in, and dads get into the labor force and get those jobs and keep those jobs. So, and then, both the lieutenant governor and the senator both talked about the importance of childcare businesses and childcare wages. And we can come back to this, but really importantly, part of that plan was to empower states to have the money to increase the pay of childcare workers and at the same time lower the cost for families. Our analysis at the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that per child, families saved about $1,250, and that the benefits to costs of these investments were 2 to 1 because of how much increased labor supply, increased economic capacity we unlocked by supporting childcare businesses all across the country. And then on top of the fact, all of these childcare businesses that didn't have to close because, or didn't have to operate at a deficit, which by the way, many of them continue to do. And CAP has done amazing work looking at childcare and childcare deserts. So it's a very long answer because it focuses on care. And at that moment, when our country needed help, when we needed to come out of that recession, making sure that that was a core part of our investments in the infrastructure of our economy was so important, and it helped folks get to work. On top of that, of course, a strong economy is going to help everybody. That's our motto, right? We say that time and time again. Getting that unemployment rate down, so proud to work for this president. We have seen an unemployment rate below 4% for a whopping 25 months, a record going back more than half a century. That means that there's been more economic opportunity. It has drawn people into labor force, as you've noted. It's also meant that the gap between Black and white unemployment has hit historic lows going back to when we first started tabulating that data in 1972, I believe. And so all of this creates that economic opportunity. So getting the unemployment rate down, getting jobs created, providing the supports that families need, not just through, importantly for women for care, but through all the different ways that the American Rescue Plan did all across the country. And then really making sure that we are fostering the kind of recovery that's going to benefit communities and bring everyone in for decades to come, which I'll let you ask another question before I go off on a new answer.
That's so hopeful. I mean, that's a lot of great news that we're seeing about unemployment, narrowing racial gaps, labor force participation. But you're an economist at the White House, so surely you know Harry Truman's quip about economists, right? Which is that he once said, "Give me a one-handed economist," because economists are always saying on the one hand, on the other hand.
Or maybe,
Yeah, so I got to ask you the on the other hand question, which is that we've had a lot of hope, a lot of a very strong recovery. But on the other hand, even though the gender wage gap was at its smallest in history in 2022, we still have a state where women are earning just 84 cents on the dollar compared to men, which my colleague Bella illustrated so powerfully in that video that you all just watched. So that means that women are still very far from parity, and if trends continued at the same rate they did between 2000 and 2002, it would take 40 years for women to achieve parity. 4 decades. That's generations of women workers who will not be paid the same as men. And that's far too long. So what can we do to speed that up?
That is way far too long. I had a birthday recently, and my sister gave me this little necklace that has broken glass in it. And I wore it today to remind myself of all the amazing women leaders that CAP has, elevated and pushed forward. Many of us who have not had to break glass ceilings because somebody else did it for us. But when I got this from her, it made me think of all the glass that's lying on the floor that we still have to step on, and that really we have not solved. We're sort of sweeping all of that up. And I think your question really gets at that. I want to start by noting that there are, with pay equity, there's a couple of issues. One is men and women tend to work in different jobs. And that's kind of the crux of why people are paid differently, right? Men and women have different opportunities in the economy, different ability, everybody has different abilities, but different opportunities to rise up the ladder and, crack that glass ceiling. But also the jobs that tend to be disproportionately held by women are the jobs that also somehow tend to be disproportionately less paid. And that includes care jobs, which I can't remember if it's Lieutenant Governor of the Senate. I think it was Lieutenant Governor who, talked about how little care workers earn. There's been some great work. I know the Economic Policy Institute did some work a couple of years ago looking at what a comparable worth wage would be for care workers. And shockingly, even though they make $12 to $13 an hour, they actually should be, based on their skills and what the job actually requires, they should be paid something more like $20 an hour. So the first thing is we have to look at the different jobs that people hold and make sure that those jobs are being paid fairly. So there's a number of different things. Getting ready for this morning, I always, before I give any talk, I go through all the fact sheets, and then I've got all these, we've done way too much to memorize. But one of the things we've done is we've raised the minimum wage for federal contractors. We've also put in place rules so that employees for federal contractors don't have to report what they made previously. So that helps a little bit with that pay discrimination in the occupations. But it's also about looking at those occupations that are underpaid and doing something for them. So then I will just revert back to the comments around care. How can we make sure, and we've done a lot to make sure that those jobs are better paid. So you have to improve the wages and job opportunities in the jobs that women already hold. And then you need to make sure that every kind of job is open to everybody. This is standard, anti-discrimination 101, making everything possible. I have been spending, and you still have this picture of this young woman in her in some sort of trades kind of job that I was looking at earlier. With my Invest in America chief economist hat on, I've been working a lot across my colleagues at the Executive Office of the President and across government. How can we make sure that as we're creating all of these new jobs in construction and manufacturing, that everybody can take advantage of them? This is the president's goal. It's part of, those series of day one orders that he put out around equity, making sure that we bring people in. But there's a lot of specific things that we've done. I had the opportunity recently to meet with some union women from the trades, some leaders to talk about, what they were doing and how we were supporting them. And then I wanted to point to the Department of Commerce has launched a Million Women in Construction initiative, which is calling on chip manufacturers, construction companies, and unions to bring women into the construction industry over the next decade. And the Department of Labor has launched the Mega Project program to foster equal employment opportunity for the bipartisan infrastructure law and CHIPS funded projects. This is so important. And there's been a little bit of discussion already about climate change, but let's just note that as we're looking forward and we're thinking about the kinds of jobs we're going to have in the decades to come, people who clean up weather-related disasters and build new things for all the things that we're going to need to replace or create for resiliency, there's going to be a lot of jobs in the trades coming down the pipeline. We are already seeing that. Part of our investments are to create a more resilient economy, to push us more towards clean energy. That is work that's going to continue to be ongoing. So not only do we have the construction work related to climate damages, but energy is moving to being manufactured, not pulled out of the ground. That's going to create different opportunities, different kinds of jobs, and we need to make sure that everyone has access to those. And that has certainly been a core part of our agenda. So you got to make sure that jobs are paid fairly and make sure that everybody has access to all the different kinds of jobs. And those are two things that I would point to specifically.
And I think one thing about jobs that we are fighting for here at CAP is making sure that people who work also have paid family and medical leave. So I want to ask you about that because that's been a topic that has been central throughout your research and career. In fact, you've got a whole book about it that you wrote. I think one reason I have hope is that over the past couple of years, we've seen some state legislatures either come very close to passing or even pass expansions of paid leave. I'm curious what you think can be done at the federal level to harness that momentum, and what you think lies ahead in the future for paid family medical leave.
Well, our budget came out this week and it's there. Yes, thank you. Again, very, very proud of the team. I'm very proud of the president that these issues around care, paid leave and childcare and in-home community-based services, and, encouraging Congress to send him legislation on 7 days of paid sick days, or, more if they want, but at least 7, and universal pre-K, the child tax credit. These are all remain incredibly important priorities for the president. Paid leave in particular is an interesting one because that is about your ability to hold down your job at those moments in your life when you need a little bit of extra time, when a new child comes into the family, when you are ill, or when you have to care for a loved one who is sick or is recovering from an illness. And those are the moments that can really push someone out of the labor force. And it is that labor force participation that builds up the skills and the expertise that allows someone to go out and bring that money into their family, kind of going back to the first point that I made. And paid leave helps increase people's connectiveness to work, and it makes it better, makes it more likely that they will return to their job after they have that life event. And so that is so important. We know that particularly for women after they have that second child, that's when they tend to drop out and not come back in. Paid leave is one piece of the puzzle. It's not, and I think it's important to remember there is no silver bullet. It's not just paid leave. It's not just childcare. It's not just pre-K. It's not just home and community-based services. It is all of the above because you need to be looking at that full spectrum of the human lived experience. But if you drop out after you have your second child, it's harder to get back in. Women then tend to not get jobs that are at the same level of pay as they had before. So you see that compounding into those lifetime learning losses. It has been so exciting to see states and places like the District of Columbia expand access to paid family leave. What we need is a federal minimum. And so having the ability to earn up to 12 weeks is a part of the federal plan. And I know so many folks in Congress have also been fighting for this. That will set the floor for what we can do. And it's really important to remember that we have created this political boundary called the United States of America that is one economy, and making sure that we are supporting people in communities all across the country isn't it such an important part of the president's vision. It's an important part of investing in America all across America, not just in some places. And so while it's wonderful that some states have had the capacity to do that, either because they had an already existing system so that they didn't have to start from scratch, or they felt that they had the wherewithal to do that, making sure that every worker in the United States has that opportunity to have that job protected paid leave, that paid leave that is also in many cases job protected through the Family Medical Leave Act, is so important to their economic success, and for making sure that we reduce the inequality gaps across the country. One statistic that I have found very exciting about this economic recovery is that over 2023, there were a number of months when the gap between the unemployment rate in the state with the highest unemployment rate and the state with the lowest unemployment rate shrunk to its lowest level ever. And that is a really important part of understanding that when you have a recovery, when you're creating economic opportunity, bringing places along, and paid leave is a really important piece of that puzzle, and we need federal intervention. I think that I continue to believe, and the president believes, because he put it in his budget, that we continue to need this.
Thank you, Heather, for all your advocacy and research into paid leave. I think we're now ready to turn to questions. We've got a mic here in the room, so I ask that if you do have questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you. As a reminder, if you can state your affiliation, your name, we'd love to hear who you are.
And we're going to start with a question from online. So we've spent the morning so far pointing to Minnesota as the forefront of incubating an economy that centers women. Where else, Heather, do you look for inspiration when it comes to states or cities or countries that are piloting or implementing the policy redesign that centers women in the economy?
Well, this is my opportunity to say that we're both from Washington State. It's also my opportunity to note that our mothers were in Bluebirds together when they were little girls. A fact that I found out many years later when my mother asked me if I knew this woman, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" At any rate, I would point to Washington State, who has been a longtime leader on these issues. To the person online, now I'm going to look at the camera. I'm looking at you. Everything from questions around universal pre-K to paid leave to paid sick days, but really focusing on and then early leadership on indexing the minimum wage to inflation. I believe Washington State, if my memory serves, was the first state in the country to do that, and just a longstanding leadership there. But I would say that I think the remarkable thing about the fight for labor standards that fit our 21st century economy is it's been happening all across the country. And I think it's also been remarkable to see this, some of the advocacy happening on the county and the city level, and giving, all labor markets, except if they're telecommuting. For the most part, labor markets are local. And so understanding that people should be thinking about what kinds of labor standards, and I would include care infrastructure as a labor standard, are happening around the country is something that it's not just at the federal or the state, but it's at the local level. So I think there's a lot of places.
I see some hands in the back.
Could you say something about how reproductive rights affect women's ability to earn and make their way?
Yes, although there's someone in the audience who is more of an expert on this than I am, my former CAP colleague, Kate Bond. So I'm just giving her a big shout out because I know she did a lot of work on that. I feel like a lot I've learned from her. Access to reproductive rights is so important for women's economic security. It's about when you choose to have children, whether or not your family can afford it, whether or not it's the right time in your life, and what those it's giving women the option to make that decision about how they're going to participate in their family life and in their life more, as a part of the economy and as a part of the rest of their lived experience. I don't have any good stats on the tip of my tongue, but if you don't have that opportunity to control your reproductive freedom, then how can you engage in all of the other parts of your life? It's just so basic and fundamental.
So we have time for one more question or time to wrap? Okay, all right. So I apologize to those of you who have questions, but we do have a next speaker coming up. So Heather, I want to say thank you so much for being here today. You've been a tremendous alum and ally of CAP, and we greatly value your partnership and your being here with us.
Well, I want to just give a big shout out to the Center for American Progress, which is an incredible institution that has put so many good ideas that on the table that have both become policy and will become policy. And I've just appreciated your leadership and the incredible work you all have been doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Up next after us will be my colleague Naveen Nayak again with Lael Brainerd of the National Economic Council.
Barbies, doctors, physicists, lawyers, and our president, all portrayed by women. In the real world, only 22% of physicist Barbies, fellow astronomers and physicists are women, and only 39% of lawyer Barbies, fellow lawyers are women. And while there's been a president Barbie since 1992, the United States has never had a female president. Women are much more likely to hold low-wage occupations, contributing to the existence and persistence of the gender wage gap that harms women and their families. Even in Barbie's high-profile careers, she's paid less than the Kens in her workplace. Looking at astronomers and physicists, women earn just 84 cents for every dollar earned by men. Lawyer Barbie would earn just 80 cents for every $1 earned by men in the real world. But the real-life Barbies are fighting back. One of the best ways to reduce the pay gap is through unionizing. Many of the actors behind Barbie are joining the writers who wrote it and thousands of other Americans, including teachers, baristas, nurses, and truck drivers, and striking for better pay and benefits. More needs to be done to ensure it is easier to join a union for all workers and improve their collective bargaining rights, including passing the PRO Act. At her best, Barbie can help inspire all little girls to work towards the career of her choosing. Critical steps towards achieving this reality include enacting universal guarantees to paid leave, raising the minimum wage, creating pathways to entry in male-dominated industries, and ensuring that all jobs are safe and free from harassment. Only then will every Barbie of every background be able to chart her own path in her career.
Excellent. Thank you all. Hey. Again, my name is Naveen Nayak with the Center for American Progress. Very excited to be here in conversation with Director of the National Economic Council, Dr. Lael Brainard.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. And we only have you for 30 minutes, so let's just jump right in. We've been talking a lot today about how the economic recovery from the pandemic has been much faster and much more broad than in past years. Not only has has unemployment stayed below 4% for the longest stretch, but we've also seen this really encouraging increase in women's participation rate in the labor force. Looking back with sort of the benefit of hindsight now, start us off sort of that wasn't inevitable. What were some of the choices you think that really made the difference to get us to this point so quickly?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. If we look back just to 2020, the economy was really in dire straits. We had millions of people unemployed, millions of women unemployed, and we had tens of thousands of small businesses that were on the brink of shuttering. People were worried about being able to stay in their homes. So many parents were multitasking, trying to educate their children and also trying to be able to continue earning a paycheck. It was a very dire period, and a lot of people were talking about the Great Resignation, how so many of these prime age workers might not actually be able to go back into the labor force. So fast forward to where we are today, it's an unbelievable recovery. If you think about the number of jobs, 15 million jobs, and women have really powered this recovery. If you look at women's participation rates, they've actually gone to historic highs. We've seen unemployment among women running at low levels for the longest stretch in decades. And earnings have gone up, so wages have risen faster than prices. Wealth has gone up, including for households headed by women. So it's been an incredibly strong recovery, and that is because the president put in place a really robust set of measures to ensure that the economy would remain strong, the labor market recovery would be exceptionally strong, and to enable women to go into the labor force in the numbers that they have.
Sorry, can I push you on any other policies in particular? Obviously, the rescue plan had a lot in it. The pieces of it that you think in hindsight really did make such, having a labor market this strong for this long, what are the lessons learned of some of the things that the administration got right that really for the future?
Well, look, when we talk about the ability of households to continue to remain resilient, keeping people in their homes was incredibly important to families all over the country in terms of renter assistance and eviction assistance, foreclosure prevention. Child tax credit, incredibly successful policy, bringing 500,000 children out of poverty and allowing parents to invest in their children's future, even during a period where the job market was really shut down. And then the strong support to states and localities allowed states and localities to direct those funding streams to the areas that they identified that were most important in their neighborhood. So in some places, it was childcare. In some places, it was housing. Childcare stabilization. We had childcare centers would have had to shutter all over the country, but for those billions of dollars that went into childcare stabilization. So it was really looking at all of those pieces that needed to be stabilized and supported that enabled the job market to come back as quickly as it did and enable people, and particularly women, to get back into the labor force.
Fantastic. And obviously as many really encouraging signs as there's been, the recovery hasn't been without its challenges, not just here, but globally, particularly with inflation. We've seen huge progress in lowering inflation over the last year in particular. This is something the president has repeatedly said is sort of his top priority, is figuring out how to keep lowering costs and prices. It's a significant pain point for all Americans, but especially women, in many cases who are, both, as we heard in the video and been hearing today, paid less compared to men and are often the breadwinners for their families. Share a little bit, maybe in areas like housing or healthcare, where the administration has had some real actions, both things that you're successes, and I know there's a lot more work to do. So if you want to take a few moments on some of the initiatives that were announced this week as well on housing.
Yeah, so while we have seen this unbelievably, sort of outperformance by the U.S. economy relative to predictions, just a year ago, some people were saying 100% chance of recession. And here we are, growth strong, employment strong, wages have risen faster than prices, but costs are too high. And the president is very focused on the everyday costs that affect working families the most. And so healthcare is a huge pain point. We pay 2 to 3 times more than other countries for prescription drugs. So we've already seen major legislation for the first time to bring insulin costs down from $400 a month to $35 a month for seniors. Now the president is calling on Congress to pass legislation to do that for everyone. The same thing for the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug prices. We're already starting with 10 this year. The president's calling to get to the point where it's 50 a year. We have succeeded in capping out-of-pocket costs for seniors on drugs at $2,000 a year. For some seniors, that's down from literally $10,000 or $15,000 a year. The president is calling on Congress now to generalize that for commercial health plans as health insurance plans as well. Housing is a huge pain point for so many American families, and that's simply because we haven't built enough houses that are affordable. For 15 years following the great financial crisis, there was much lower building. At the same time as the millennial generation, the largest generation in American history, was ready to go off and form households of their own. And so the houses that were built were high-end houses. And so now the president is saying we need to build 2 million more affordable houses. Let's put that in the budget. We know how to do that through tax credits. But right now, let's unlock the housing market so people who are first-time home buyers can get a $10,000 credit to buy their first home. People that are sitting in their houses because their mortgage rates are better than what they could get today, let's give them a $10,000 credit to put those starter homes on the market. And let's massively expand assistance for renters.
Fantastic. I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, sort of the predictions of a lot of economists, including people who sat in your role, saying that not only there'd be a recession, we'd have to get to 6% unemployment if we were going to tackle inflation. That didn't happen. What did they get wrong, and what did sort of the president and his team get right?
Yeah, so I think that set of predictions, which were quite uniform, were that we'd have to see a very high unemployment increase in order to get the 2/3 decline in inflation that we've already seen. So inflation has come down by a lot, but actually unemployment has remained below 4% now for more than 2 years. And that is also true for unemployment among women participants in the labor force. So it's a great story. Why did that happen? Because a lot of the inflation came from disruptions on the supply side, and the president's team worked day and night to address some of those supply disruptions, whether it was in the ports or in rail, massively expanding apprenticeships for truckers so that we would have capacity, investing in semiconductors, because semiconductors were the big constraint in so many durable goods like cars and washing machines. And then the piece that we were just talking about, which is nobody expected the massive expansion in labor force that we have seen. And that has been an expansion on the supply side of the economy, which has allowed us to see this incredibly positive trajectory of strong growth, strong employment, and inflation coming down. And some of that, a large part of that, is that women are back in the labor force to a larger degree than they were pre-pandemic. Nobody predicted that. And that goes back to the kinds of policies that we know enable people to be in the labor force. So family leave is really important. We know that in countries that provide support for childcare, Canada is a great example. They pioneered these policies to have childcare cost $10 a day, and they got a 2 percentage point increase in participation in one of their provinces in the next 2 years. Like, that's why this is in the president's budget, because we know those are the things that enable women and parents, women, mothers in particular, to be able to be active in the workforce. That in turn is critical for our growth, our productivity, our nation's future.
That is actually where I was hoping to go. So this is perfect. Obviously, a great success story last year, sort of women's participation rate in the labor market high for women aged 25 to 54. And yet, as my colleagues at CAP have shown, if you compare us to other countries, especially G7, we lag far behind. You mentioned a couple of things. I want you to expand a bit more. You mentioned childcare, obviously, but other policies that our peers have put in place that are actually allowing them to reach even higher rates of labor participation.
Yeah, so I think the evidence here is just so compelling, right? We started out the United States with among the highest participation rate for women as women were really coming into the labor force. And over the subsequent decades, we have slipped to the sort of bottom of the pack. And a lot of compelling research suggests it's because we haven't put in place the supports that enable women to participate at the same level in the workforce. And particularly, that is true when they have burdens of care that are not supported by programs like support for childcare, where the president is really pushing hard for $10 a day childcare for people with certain levels of income, universal pre-K for children that are 4, which would be enormously beneficial, both in terms of investing in the future of our children, but also enabling more parents to be able to be in the workforce. Family leave is really important. And so it's really a host of interlocking policy supports that we have seen decisively in other countries make the material difference between participation rates of women relative to what we're seeing here in the US.
I say from a personal perspective, I was born and raised in Quebec, and it was capped at $7 a day for childcare. Still, I think not even double that 30 years later. So just an incredible contrast. You sort of touched on how important that would be for sort of women's participation in the labor market. Kind of, you've obviously served on the Fed Reserve as vice chair. From a macroeconomic perspective, tell us more about what these sort of investments in childcare in elderly care would actually mean for the economy overall, in addition to women's participation?
Yeah, so this is not just good policy at the level of families and investing in the future. It is just good growth policy. One of the biggest, most obvious ways to expand the supply side of the economy, enable us to make all these great investments around the country. We've got all these great manufacturing jobs that are coming online in, the clean energy transition, in semiconductors, in infrastructure. Well, how do we do that? We have to have more people filling those jobs. And so expanding the labor force through higher women's participation is one of the kind of smartest policies, the greatest policy for equity. Because, as you open up more of these great, secure, family sustaining jobs for women, it's also raises incomes, investments in the family's kind of future. So it's win-win-win. And we really have not only tried to encourage policies like the child tax credit, like childcare, like family leave, but we've also tried to open up some of these great career pathways for women, for instance, working with the building trades to really make these great jobs more accessible to women through registered apprenticeships, which are great pathways for people that don't want a four-year degree, but still want to get the skills and to be able to have those family sustaining, secure jobs.
Fantastic. We're going to open it up in a second. I'm just going to ask you one more question. Obviously, a lot of great data that points to sort of the success over the last couple of years, but in a very intuitive sense, there's another way in which the American people sort of understand the role that women have been playing in driving our economic growth, which is Barbie, Beyonce, Taylor Swift have been economic engines over the last year, not only as entrepreneurs and as artists, but the consumers of their work have been, disproportionately women. So two questions. One is, if you had to choose one to go watch, Barbie, Beyonce, or Taylor Swift, who would you pick? And do you think we will look back on this past year as really a moment where we sort of finally started to appreciate what a force women were in helping drive our economic growth?
Yeah. So look, I love the Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Barbie economy analogy. I mean, they really did drive a lot of consumer excitement and activity in a year that turned out to be so much better than anybody could have anticipated. So, kudos to those incredible creators. And they really did, I think, create a lot of focus around the ability of women to drive economic activity and creative activity. In terms of making a choice, so in my household, Taylor Swift and Beyonce are equally beloved. And I will say that when it came time to purchasing tickets, which I was asked about, unfortunately, after they click through all the, screens that you have to get through to actually go to a live event, and I looked at the prices, I said, I'm so sorry, we cannot go, which is one of the reasons that the president is fighting so hard to get rid of these awful junk fees that make it impossible for people to go and enjoy those incredible live events.
Excellent. All this on message. Thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes for questions first in the audience. My colleague Diane, I think there's one up front here first. Thanks.
Thank you. Joan Michelson, Electric Ladies podcast. I'd love to interview for my show. One of the pet peeves of the economy globally, as well as in the US, is the GDP and the GNP formulas don't actually include labor that does not have currency exchange. And it doesn't include the impact on the environment, on the energy of the economy. So, and yet those formulas are used for allocating so many other resources. I mean, at the core of a million other resources that affect how much people get money from the local level to other countries. So how would you change the formula of the GNP and the GDP to make sure that women's non-paid economic labor. I mean, it's, you know, we're talking about what a big impact it has on the economy. Let's measure it. How do we get it into those formulas that have such a huge impact across the economy?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that, you know, what we measure determines so much how we allocate resources and the choices we make. And that's why what we measure is so critically important. And there is a lot of really good work in trying to value women's work, whether it takes place in the formal economy or not. And those numbers are really different when you do that. Similarly, you mentioned the climate cost and valuing that. And there are efforts to do that. In fact, Heather, who was just here, really is working hard on that within the Biden administration. Those things are incredibly important. And the more that we have, unfortunately, it does actually take a while. It took a long time to get to the current concepts of measurement that we have. And it does take a while to be able to value a number of things that aren't valued in the market, you know, with clear prices currently. But there's a lot of great work underway. And I do believe over time that those concepts will start to become accepted and decisions will increasingly be made based on those.
Diane, oh, there's a question up here.
After this question, we'll move to an online question.
Great.
Hi, I'm Abby Woodward. I wanted to add to what isn't counted in our current equations is things like the cost of gun violence. So you talk about, you know, this is the money that you make when you sell the guns, but that omission is eminently, you know, impressive right now.
Yeah. And that, you know, we do look at that and crime in general, and that makes a huge effect on people's quality of life and the security they feel, the investments they make. So really important to continue that fight.
Great. Lily, do you have a question online?
Yeah, we do. This question from online, we've talked a lot about women in the labor force and getting women into occupations and sectors where they're historically underrepresented. But can you speak to women as entrepreneurs and how you and the administration are thinking about female small business owners as drivers of economic growth?
Yeah, great question. And I'm glad you highlighted that. So the number of small business applications from women and women of color is just through the roof, record numbers. It's been so exciting. And it is in part because we have really tried hard to provide supports for small businesses in general, but for groups that are termed disadvantaged, groups that have not been traditionally as well represented in entrepreneurship, haven't gotten access to the federal procurement contracts, haven't gotten access to the small business credit. Isabella Guzman has been a phenomenal advocate and a phenomenal administrator of all of the resources we have at the Small Business Administration, but it's really been a whole of government effort where procurement is such an important lever that we can use to make sure these small businesses get access to these contracts. We just did a convening actually even on the Department of Defense, which has very large procurements, has made a real effort to reach to smaller businesses, disadvantaged businesses, and that lifts up women-owned businesses, women of color-owned businesses, and of course, more generally, minority-owned businesses. And the president has had a lot of sort of events with some of these women, small business owners. And you might have noticed Natalie King sitting in the box with the First Lady, just to emphasize how excited we are about some of the businesses that have been enabled by all the great programs.
Fantastic. No more questions. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your insights and your work. This is a really exciting moment and a lot more work to do. So appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
I think we're going to take a few minutes break here. So feel free to grab some food if you're here with us. If you're at home, take a bio break if you need one, and we'll start again at 11:30. Thanks all.
Things that drive the pay gap. One is where women work. Two is the fact that we have terrible care policies, and women, generally speaking, are far more likely to take time away from work to care for their families or to do all of the things that need to happen just to make sure that their family is functioning properly. And three, discrimination. And that's true for Black women. If you look at where they work, they disproportionately are working in lower paid jobs, what people refer to as occupational segregation. If you look at the top 10 jobs where Black women disproportionately work, those tend to be lower paying. They're home health aides, they're personal care aides, they're nursing assistants that tend to be lower paid in comparison to the jobs where white men are working. Their top 10 jobs are laborer jobs that, you know, they tend to have just higher wages. If you compare those jobs and you look at the average wages, Black women are earning about $50,000 less than their white counterparts just based on the top 10 jobs where they typically work. On top of that, you have Black women disproportionately in low paid jobs, the service sector, public service sector, and so forth, that tend to be lower paid jobs. And then we have workplaces that have consistently devalued Black women's work for decades, since they started working in the United States of America. And in that reality, they face not only sexism, but racism, but just perceptions that their work is less valuable. So when you combine that all together, you have persistent pay disparities. And that has been true whether you're looking at the jobs where they're more likely to work. If you look at jobs where they're doing the same job as somebody else, they're just making less than their white male counterpart or their white female counterpart. So you have to fix all those things, right? Like you can't just fix one thing and make it go away. We have to have strategies that are really talking about how do you tackle discrimination? How do you make sure that folks, when they take time off from work, that they're not being overly penalized? And how do you actually make sure that the jobs where they're working are actually valued and paid better?
Yeah, and so when we talk about the pay gap, we talk about it in cents, but it isn't really a couple of cents lost, right? It's like adds up to thousands and thousands of dollars in lost income in a given year. And for Black women, it really snowballs over the course of their life to have detrimental impacts in older age and retirement. And so how do you think about the connection between the pay gap and the racial wealth gap and, the ability of Black women to accumulate wealth?
Right. Well, I think your question points us in exactly the right direction. When you add up the 67 cents or 64 cents and add off the dollar, when you look over a 40-year career, Black women on average are losing a little under $1 million over their lifetime or their work lifetime, 40-year career, because of the pay gap. When you step back from that and recognize that in terms of economic stability, it's not just about your earnings. That's a piece of it. But when you think about how people build wealth, it's also about the assets that you're able to acquire. It's the financial investments that you're able to make over a lifetime and so forth. So if you're always sort of scrambling to make ends meet and never putting savings away, then you're going to have less to retire on. You're going to have less to live on in as you get older. And we see that with Black women historically. The wealth gap is enormous when you compare them to their white counterparts. And not only does that mean that they are having difficulty in terms of surviving over their lifetimes, but it also means that they have less to pass off to their children and their families and so forth. And when you understand what wealth looks like, earnings is only one component of it. It is your ability to have a house that you can hand off as an asset and, savings and other sorts of things. So the pay gap is one piece of a broader puzzle in terms of how do you make sure that people can not only be economically secure now, but really just going forward. And we have to be intentional about addressing both if we're really going to create economic stability for people over their lifetimes.
Yeah. And so when we think about how to address this, right? So one of the things that policymakers can do is raise the minimum wage, right? So CAP recently released an analysis that showed that if the minimum wage had been $15 in 2021, Black women's pay gap would have had its largest reduction on record. So it's very clear that the existence of the pay gap for Black women is a choice by policymakers. So what do you think are some meaningful steps policymakers could be taking to help close the pay gap?
Well, I think in addition to that, there are things like the Paycheck Fairness Act is a long-standing piece of legislation that would close some of the gaps in the law itself. It's hard to bring an equal pay case. It would make it harder for employers to use things like salary history as a mechanism to keep people stuck at a particular salary. It would deal with some of the longstanding issues that just make it harder for people to surface pay discrimination, to bring more transparency. So even just enabling folks to unearth discrimination is a way to push back. Things like pay data collection, just requiring employers to report their pay data, again, as an enforcement tool to hopefully push employers to think more concretely and look more concretely at their pay practices. So there are things like that that can be done. But there are also things that have to do with how do you make sure that women, in particular, when they go to work, if they need to take off time for caregiving, aren't being penalized. Things like paid leave, paid family leave, paid sick days, better childcare, like all of those care supports are really integral to the ability of women to be able to stay in the workforce uninterrupted, as opposed to having to leave their job because they have to care for their families. So there are things like that that can be helpful in terms of helping to close the gap. I think it is important for people to understand that all those things have to work in tandem, right? Like there's not a one size fits all solution. The last thing I would say is it is really important to be intentional about the reality that Black women, Latinas often are encountering discrimination based on a number of factors, right? It's not just about gender, it's also about race and also about, sort of assumptions about Black women workers that may be unique to them. So it's important for employers to look really closely at not simply what their pay gap is, but what's your pay gap for Black women? What's your pay gap for Latinas? And, I often say to people, if you're not solving the pay gap for Black women, then you're not solving the pay gap. Don't tell me that you've closed your gender gap, but yet you don't know whether or not Black women and Latinas and Native women in your workforce are being paid the same, right? Like you have to look that closely to really understand how this is playing out amongst your workers.
Yeah, and I think that point is really important because the context of a life of a Black woman is very different to other women, right? And so something I know that you've really emphasized is talking about how Black women work more than other women in the labor market. And Black mothers tend to be mothers that are most likely to be their family's breadwinner. So what would you say are the implications of the pay gap, not just on Black women, but also their families?
Well, I think it is important for people to recognize that Black women often play a unique role in their families. If you look at mothers, generally speaking, Black mothers are the ones who are most likely to be the primary or sole breadwinners. More than 2/3 of Black mothers are primary or sole breadwinners in their families. If you look even more broadly at breadwinners, either co-breadwinners, so people who are maybe they're not the sole source of support, but they are an important source of support. More than 80% of Black mothers are, some form of breadwinner in their family. That's an enormous number of families, and that means that their pay is really critical to the stability of those families. It's not enough to just pay Black women a wage, right? If you're paying them a wage where they're going to earn, $50,000 less or $1 million less across a lifetime, that has an enormous effect on their families. And Black women, generally speaking, the families headed by Black women are a significant portion of Black families generally, right? So all of that is to say that Black women are really key to the economic stability of Black communities. And you have to make sure that they are being paid fairly. And if you create that ability to have some security in those families, stability in those families, you will then enable them to, as we said earlier, do the consumer spending, help the community thrive economically. Those things go hand in hand, but it starts with making sure that you're actually focusing on how do you make sure that Black women are paid what they deserve.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit to think about, the current state of play in the economy right now, and in particular for women. So we've seen since the COVID-19 recession, I would say like a much more equitable economic recovery, particularly in like the jobs market than that of the past. So over the last year, we've seen Black women's unemployment rate like hit a record low, employment rates for Latinas hit a record high. So what would you say are some of the lessons policymakers could take from their response to the COVID-19 recession? And do you see this progress in terms of women's employment? Is that a temporary progress? Do you see that there's opportunities for setbacks? How do we make that progress permanent as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think people have not paid enough attention to what happened during the pandemic, how we've made progress, and how do you actually sustain the progress? Because we have seen important gains for Black women and women generally speaking, where we've seen people come back, but you have to ask yourself, why did that happen? And so one reason it happened is because people were actually really intentional about making sure that folks were actually making decent wages, that they had the supports that they needed to make sure they had a caregiving obligation, that they were able to take that time. Boosting wages and giving people other sorts of supports helps them actually go to work, stay in work, and support their families. It's not rocket science, actually. And I think if we continue to invest in policies like that, we will do enormous things for not only Black women, but for women workers generally. And the Biden administration, I think, has been focused on what are the suite of interventions necessary to really improve women's employment and also help women workers stay in the workforce.
Hi, folks. If you could make your way back into the atrium, we will begin shortly. Yeah. Yep, we're good. Hi, folks in the lobby. If you could make your way back into the atrium, the event will begin shortly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Estep. I am the Associate Director of the Women's Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really happy to see so many familiar faces in the room. It was just CAP's 20th anniversary, and I'm really happy to see so many former CAPers here, so many faces that I recognize that are doing amazing things across DC, including those on our stage. Before I introduce our panelists, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. Live captioning is available if you're viewing online. If you're in person, it's over there. We will also be taking questions at the end of this panel. They are available online using the questions tab, I believe, and someone will be coming around with a mic if you're joining us in person. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. Next to me, I have Deborah Vagans. She is the National Campaign Director at Equal Rights Advocates and also the Director of Equal Pay Today. And then I have Emily Martin. She is the Chief Program Officer at the National Women's Law Center. And beside her, I have Jocelyn Fry, the President of the National Partnership for Women and Families, and Dr. Jamila Taylor, the President and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Thank you. So when we were writing this playbook, we were pretty frustrated with the way that policymakers would talk about women's issues as though they were separate from our economy and economic issues. And that was in spite of the fact that women were making massive gains in the labor market and were contributing so broadly to our economic recovery. In fact, women's labor force participation only grew when we account for age adjustment because of women, and particularly women with children. I'll start with a question for our panelists. All of them. How should researchers at think tanks and research organizations across DC, who are often trying to change policy, use our research as a tool to help change this narrative about women being somehow separate from economic policy? I'll start with Deb, and we'll move that way.
Well, first, I just want to thank CAP for having us here today, and I'm honored to be on this stage with these women. So thank you for that opportunity, and also find it intimidating to have a giant picture of my head, which is now not there anymore. So that's good. So as a policy advocate and now someone who designs campaigns, there are sort of always a few things that are steadfast when you want to affect policy change. It is good data, good stories that resonate, publicity, and actually public pressure that moves policymakers in the right direction, in the way that you want. And so I think research like this needs to be integrated into a big campaign, which you are already doing. And I think, in fact, that's why we are here, to try to get the message out about that discrepancy about women's and the sort of the segregation in the economic recovery. So I think the story is this, right? So women are quite literally the backbone of the economy. They perform, or they performed, the majority of low-wage jobs and are often on the front lines. And during COVID, that meant that they were exposed to lethal consequences. They account for the growth, the majority of the growth, the majority of the workforce, they're the majority in many instances of the voting electorate, and they drove the economic recovery. But what we're seeing is that they are still making less in all sectors and in every sector of the economy. And I think the story then is that is to the US's economic peril, that will ultimately be to policymakers' peril. And they would be adding billions to the economy if they were being paid what they rightfully earned. So I just think that researchers getting out that story, working with communicators, will ultimately kind of close the gap that we're seeing between the reality of what's happening and the way that it's being polarized.
Thank you.
Well, I first of all will add my gratitude for being part of this conversation with all of you in the room and online. And I think I wholeheartedly endorse everything Deb just said. And as Sarah pointed out, there is still often this false distinction that's made between a conversation around identity issues and a conversation around economic growth in the country. And I think what is so important about the research that you all are releasing is that it really demonstrates in dollars and cents terms in really concrete ways how that distinction is absolutely false. And that's critically important to help people understand that it is when we talk about gender equity, when we talk about gender justice, that's both a dollars and cents issue for individual women and for the families and households that depend on their income, yes. And also, it is a question that goes to the health of our economy as a whole. Yesterday was Equal Pay Day, and one of the things that we at the National Women's Law Center lift up every Equal Pay Day is how the wage gap adds up over the course of a lifetime. For women of color, it can be $1 million or more lost to the wage gap over a lifetime. That is life-changing money, not just for individuals and their families, but for communities and for the US as a whole. And I think it's especially important to name this at a moment when we are seeing backlash and retrenchment from the right across a range of issues that are critical to the healthy functioning of our democracy, very much including gender roles and gender expectations. And to make clear in the conversation about gender equality that yes, it is critically important because of the individual lives and futures that are at stake. And also, it is critically important for all of us that that women's success drives the success of the American economy in micro and macro ways. And so I think the data that you all are lifting up is so important in this moment to be making that case that everybody has a lot at stake when we are talking about gender justice. So really glad to be part of the conversation here today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be on the panel with everybody else and great to be back at CAP and see a lot of wonderful, familiar faces. I think what I would say is that the role of research organizations and think tanks are really important for a couple of reasons. One is, and I think about this particularly when I focus on CAP's mission, is to really talk about what does an inclusive economy look like? What does an equitable economy look like? And I think that answer starts with really thinking critically about what does a transformational, vision for the future look like? And you have to challenge assumptions that I think lead people to put women on the periphery. Challenge assumptions that our economy operates fairly. The reality is that our economy, was built on the backs of women. It was built on the backs of women of color. It was built with entrenched biases, not simply intact, but assumed in terms of how the economy functions. So you have to start with challenging a status quo that was never constructed for everybody to be successful. And once you understand that premise, then you can start focusing on, well, how do we actually make it right? What is it that we do in our analyses and our reports and our studies that actually center equity and center the folks who are left out? And so, for example, you look at an issue that is near and dear to my heart and an issue that CAP has worked on, paid leave. If you put women in the center of that conversation, then it allows you to both analyze the flaws in the economy and it gets you really quickly to solutions that would make it better. CAP research shows that families lose out on $22.5 billion a year in wages because there is no paid leave. Our economy loses $650 billion a year. That's partnership research because women are not participating in our economy at the same level as other industrialized nations. So when you analyze the economy and how it works for families from that perspective, then it takes you to solutions that not only work for women, but put women right back in the center. So I think it's important to start with challenging the assumptions that somehow women on the periphery make sense. And making clear that if we want an economy that's actually working for everybody, then we actually have to construct our analysis in a way that takes account of all of the folks that we need to participate.
Absolutely. Good morning. So I want to echo Jocelyn's point about I'm also a former CAP staff, and it feels really good to be at home and to see you all here today. I also want to say Happy Women's History Month to those in the audience as well as those joining us online. And I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said on this issue. And I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is the importance of intersectionality. Especially when we think about women of color and how we interact with the economy. The fact that women, period, do not lead single issue lives, right? And so as we talk about issues like paid leave, caregiving, reproductive health care, pay equity, we know that all of these gender policies, they're not only good for women, but they're good for the economy. They're good for everyone. And so for me, as I enter into this conversation, I like to start there, right? And so at IWPR, we're doing the economic analysis, but we're also thinking about other issues that intersect in women's lives, like access to healthcare, pay equity, paid leave, all of these issues. Another example I want to lift up here is childcare and early childhood education. Families currently spend about 11% of their income on childcare. There are 3 and 4-year-olds, and the percentage is higher for Black families. IWPR's research shows that universal pre-K would save families $17 billion per year. Childcare is also good for society. It helps the economy by ensuring that parents can work. Universal preschool also improves school readiness and long-term educational benefits for children, and the list goes on and on. I think we sell ourselves short if we only focus on these issues in the context of women in particular, but really thinking about it for the whole family. I'll also add here that, I met a woman a couple of days ago in a board meeting that I was participating in, and she talked to me. Well, the conversation started. She asked me where I work, what I do, and I told her. And she said, well, what is a feminist economist? It's a good one, right? And so But the conversation was interesting because for her in that initial interaction, she didn't really understand why a feminist economist would be important for her life, right? And then she proceeded to talk about giving birth to her daughter 35 years ago and not having access to childcare. She also talked about the fact that she only had 2 weeks off from work after giving birth to her daughter. And so, as we engaged in that conversation on a personal level, I then proceeded to connect the dots for her on why it's important for feminist economists like those that work with IWPR to do the work that they do. And so anytime that we can also engage with broader audiences about why we're doing this work, why it's important, I think that's also essential to this conversation about how these policies that we're pushing forth are not only good for women and families, but they're good for the broader economy, they're good for society.
I want to piggyback off of some of the things that Dr. Taylor and Jocelyn were talking about earlier. Obviously, there are wage gaps that are much larger for women of color, and an intersectional approach to our analysis is incredibly important when we're trying to understand these gaps. If we want to foster broad-based growth, it's going to be really important that we have fair pay for women. And we know that as women age, the wage gap just grows over their lifetime. And when we compare their wages to men, I think I'd like to ask Deb this question, even though I know all of the women on this stage could talk about equal pay. But Deb, you are the director of Equal Pay Today. You do a lot of work on this. Could you please talk about some of the work you're doing at ERA and EPT and what tools we should be using to close the gap? And also maybe like some of the wins we've had in both states and federally over the last couple of years.
Absolutely. And it's very true. All of the women on the stage could talk about it, and all of these wonderful organizations are part of the Equal Pay Today campaign. But if just one moment of personal privilege, which is a feminist economist, I went to, that was what I had gone to college for, and promptly had to change my major because of sexism in the department. And when you look at the Nobel Peace Prize, you know, for, right, today, like it's, there is change is slow, but change will come, and we're all a part of it. So I just had to say that for the feminist economists out there. So Equal Pay Today, thank you, is a nationwide coalition of about 50 organizations, state, local, federal. We also have thousands of activists that work on equal pay issues. We work to close the gender and race wage gaps. We work for state policy change and try to drive federal momentum on federal policy change. And over the last 10 years, I am very happy to say, since the founding of Equal Pay Today, there have been 150 state laws that have, largely in the pay equity space, the pay transparency space, that have been enacted. And so progress is happening. And we help organize, along with our partners, the Equal Pay Days of the year, which you just talked about earlier this week. And we also put forward a policy agenda. I know my colleagues will be talking about policy changes that we need, but on that agenda, it identifies the intersectionality of the wage gap, and that it's complicated and there's not one solution. We've talked about some of the issues that cause the wage gap. So before, I think, and it could be a failure of the communication around the work. The wage gap, when you look at those wage gaps numbers, it's not just caused by a lack of unequal pay for equal work. There are many things that drive it. So there is, of course, lack of equal pay for equal work, but there's also lack of pay transparency. There is the failure to provide workplace protections against harassment or pregnancy discrimination or caregiver discrimination. There is the continued occupational segregation of women in lower paid fields, the sub-minimum wage, the wage theft. There is also the lack of paid family leave or sick and safe days that make women, push women out of the workforce and decrease their wages. So there are a lot of reasons we continue to see that continuing number and that closing so slowly. And what that means is that there are policy reforms that need to address all of those things. And so, our policy agenda talks about it and my colleagues will talk about it, but there are 4 that I just wanted to quickly mention today to sort of set the scene for the table for it. And one is, you've probably heard lot about it, much about it, the Paycheck Fairness Act, and that is something that would update and modernize the Equal Pay Act of 1963. I'm sure my colleagues will mention why that's so important. There's also the Salary Transparency Act. And the reason I'm mentioning these is because there's in a very positive development, there has been a trend to talk more about wage transparency. We used to be on the defensive. We used to be trying to stop people from getting fired for just asking about their wages. But now people are demanding more, and rightfully so. They want to see what jobs pay, what the job ranges are. They don't want their prior salary history to be used in setting their current wages. So the Salary Transparency Act would require the posting of job ranges. But until we can get things through Congress, and I know you all know how hard that is, the Biden administration is also moving forward on executive action to ban the use of salary history in the federal workforce and federal contracting workforce. And we also are urging the EEOC to reinstate its pay data collection, because that's a very important tool for enforcement as well. And so with these victories, I've mentioned the state victories, I've mentioned some of the executive branch victories, but I also think there's been a messaging victory, and that is people used to think that this was a back burner issue or an issue that wasn't front and center to the economy. I think your report goes a long way in showing that it is integral to economic recovery. And we've also been winning on this trend where we're no longer in a defensive posture about the issues or just preventing people from getting fired, which unfortunately we still are. But we're also, the current electorate and the current demographics are now demanding more, and demanding that we look at the intersectionality of the problem as well.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we obviously work to create better jobs and better wages in industries where women do dominate, but it's also really important that we get women to enter fields that they are typically underrepresented in. These can include occupations like construction, STEM fields like engineering, and all of these fields require a lot of education and training. And that means that women need access to these programs. They need to be able to go into apprenticeship programs so that they can enter these male-dominated jobs. But it also means that when women enter these jobs, they need to be able to do so free from sex discrimination and harassment in the workplace. I know that, Jocelyn, you have worked on this quite a bit, and so has Emily. I was wondering if the two of you could both discuss some of the policy actions that we can take to ensure that women are protected in the workplace, and what those protections mean for our economy at large.
Sure, I'll start. You're absolutely right that one of the ways that you actually improve the economic standing of women is that you get them into higher paying jobs. And, they historically have been traditionally male jobs. And so I think there are a couple of things that you can do. One is, you already spoke about this, is really being intentional about it. I mean, that's the first thing that, we have sort of assumptions of what types of jobs women do and what types of jobs the men do. So starting with the assumption that a job should be available to everybody, and being intentional about opening up those opportunities, thinking about it in a very targeted way, whether you're talking about apprenticeship programs or other sorts of feeder programs that may be operated by unions, using that as a starting point. And then when you get folks into jobs, those programs, making sure that they actually get tapped at the end of it. If you talk to women who have been in the construction field and the trades for a long time, they will tell you, yes, I went through the program, but then I never got called, or, I would never get picked. So once you have contractors and subcontractors, putting the onus on them to say, I expect you to actually make use of these people. I'm going to actually see what percentage of the folks that you have that you've tapped actually come from diverse perspectives and have gender diversity and reflect a range of inclusive metrics. I think those are things you can start with. But I also think it's not just about even just picking people and hiring them, is making sure you can retain them. And what we know, and you alluded to it, is that, there are longstanding concerns about discrimination and bias that happens in these fields. And also just the practical issues of access to childcare, access to other sorts of work family supports, because we know that many of those women also have other sorts of caregiving responsibilities. So the understanding that when those contractors are hiring people, it's not just about bringing those people on and letting them fend for themselves and ignoring the workplace and the culture of that workplace. It's also thinking about what is it that we're going to do to make sure we can retain women workers in the same way that we can retain male workers. And it's part of the reason that you've seen, commerce and transportation focusing on access to childcare as a priority because they want to make sure that those contractors are actually creating a level playing field for women to be successful. So I think those, in addition to, like passing the Paycheck Fairness Act, there are other sorts of legislative efforts. But the other thing I would say that it's not counter to your question, but I feel like I have to say it, is that we should do all those things to ensure that women can access high-paying jobs. But we also should not be satisfied with women in traditionally female occupations consistently being underpaid, right? Like teachers, caregivers, that is where the majority of women work. And that is probably going to be true for a long time. And their work has historically been devalued because they do that work, right? Like because caregivers are disproportionately women of color, that is why people have been paying them less for a very long time. There is no reason for that work to be devalued. If we had any confusion about that, we just went through a pandemic that told us how important those jobs were. So part of the work is also thinking about how you boost those wages, how you pay them better, and how you make sure that you're actually paying them equitably. And I respect all the construction, manufacturing, but when I think about what really undergirds the foundation of this country, it is just as much about those caregivers as it is about those construction workers. So we ought not to distinguish them so much that we're paying them in such a disparate way. So I think both things have to happen.
Yeah, agree. And I would say, in thinking about opening the pathways to higher paying male dominated jobs, absolutely. Part of the answer to breaking down those barriers is taking harassment seriously, both in the workplace, in apprenticeship programs, and also in education programs, since career and technical education, STEM fields, et cetera, to go to Deb's point, sometimes women never get to that traditionally male occupation because in school, they were already experiencing such a hostile environment. They decided this really isn't worthwhile. So as a piece of the puzzle to closing the wage gap, to building truly equitable opportunities across occupations, taking seriously creating a culture of civility within both educational programs and in the workplace is absolutely necessary, since often in male-dominated occupations, the entrance of women is considered sort of a deep threat to the identity of the men who are working in those jobs. Those are the occupations where often harassment is the most virulent and vile. And ensuring that the anti-harassment protections are really designed in a way to enable women's full participation. So as an example, National Women's Law Center just brought an EEOC charge a few months ago against a trucking company that has a rule that women who want to work as truckers have to be trained by other women. And the trucking company says, well, this is our anti-harassment, anti-sexual assault measure because these people, they are in the truck on their own for a long time. So this is our anti-harassment program. However, because they don't have enough women on the job, because it is mostly men who are truck drivers, what that means is that women who say, I would like to be a truck driver, are told, no, we don't have any openings. We don't have anybody to train you, or you're going to have to wait for a year and then maybe we'll call you. It's just such a parable and tidy illustration of the difference between really investing in solutions that enable women's full participation and actually using the absence of women from a workplace as an excuse to continue to exclude women. So there is a range of federal and state policy solutions that would help answer this. And we have seen at the state level in particular, a little bit in the federal level, a lot of policy movement over the last 5 or 6 years since Me Too went viral. Next month, we're expecting the Be Heard in the Workplace Act and the SAFER Act, which addresses education, to be reintroduced, which are really sort of marker bills about how do we update and reinvigorate our protections against harassment on the basis of sex, on the basis of race, on the basis of disability, on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and ensuring that those are really meaningful and can be fully enforced in court. One of the things that I think is exciting about the Be Heard in the Workplace Act is, in addition to strengthening our workplace harassment laws, it would also create programs to support individuals who are bringing forward harassment challenges in court. So to ensure that there are nonprofits available who can help you through that process and actually ensure that the laws are real. So those are part of the solution. And I would also echo Jocelyn and so many others in saying that whether you're talking about traditionally male occupations or looking more broadly at the workforce, that childcare is a huge part of the solution. Investing in childcare as a public good, as infrastructure, so that it is available and affordable and pays childcare workers a livable wage, really ensures that they are compensated at the rate at which they should be. That is major unfinished work. An analysis that the National Women's Law Center did with CLASP a couple years ago found that expanding access to affordable, high-quality childcare to everyone who needs it would increase the number of prime-age women with young children working full-time, full year by about 17%. And for women without any college degree, it would increase by 31%. So really talking about unlocking a part of our economy that is now unable to participate because of the incredible structural barriers we put in the way of people, and in particular women, who have childcare obligations. And that's a piece of like a larger set of reforms, from protections against caregiver discrimination to ensuring fair and predictable work schedules to protections against pregnancy discrimination, that those are all part of the solution.
Thank you. And we definitely do acknowledge that that is part of the solution in our playbook. We have a chapter on childcare. We also have research on elder care, including direct care workers. And we also have some analysis of how we could potentially expand our immigration system to help support our healthcare needs going into the future, because the population is aging and we do expect to need to expand those industries. I need to just announce again that we will be taking questions, so please have those prepared. If you are online, please submit those using the tab on your screen. And there's really no great way for me to segue into reproductive rights being taken away, but just a few weeks ago, the Senate Budget Committee held a hearing on the economics of abortion access. And in the playbook itself, we detail the many years of economic research that show that access to abortion and reproductive freedom and family planning and contraception all increase women's labor force participation, wages, their educational attainment, their health and their families' health outcomes. And so clearly, increasing abortion access is an economic issue. I was wondering if Dr. Taylor, if you could talk about what living in a post-Dobbs world means for women's economic security, and also how that affects the economy more broadly.
Sure, absolutely. You already sort of went through some of the key pieces of this when it comes to abortion care and what it means in the context of women's lives from an economic standpoint. You talked about, women being able to participate in the labor force, earning higher wages. I think another key piece to keep in mind is that about 60% of women who do have abortions already have children. So access to an abortion also allows for women to parent the children they already have with dignity and to support their families. Abortion access is also fundamental to equality, freedom, dignity, and also economic well-being. This issue impacts women across the lifespan, actually. I think, particularly when it comes to debates around abortion, it's hard to sort of put that into context. This is such a politically charged issue. At the same time, it just makes good sense that women have access to abortion. When it comes to the evidence around what support for, I think, abortion and contraception means, and also to thinking about it in the context, again, of the broader economic evidence, we know that access to contraception and abortion have positive impacts on, women's graduating from high school, their graduation rates, occupation earnings, health incomes, which I already mentioned. Also, the health impacts, delaying childbearing and pregnancy. Would women want to do that when they have other goals and aspirations, I think is really key. I'll also say too that, there was a study, the Turnaway study, which was conducted that compared outcomes of women who were denied abortion to those who were able to get the abortions that they needed. And what the study showed is that, women who were denied the abortions experienced a 78% increase in past due debt, as well as 81% increase in bankruptcy, tax liens, and evictions. And these are stats that, those of us that come from the reproductive rights community have known for years. We've also heard stories from women who have had to, have really been in situations where they had to do things like sell their stoves so they could pay for an abortion. They have had to forego paying their rent so they could pay for an abortion, other healthcare costs, diapers for the children that they already have. So this is a critical economic issue. And while we see the harshest impacts on women and families, again, the conversation today is about the broader economy, right? And I just want to flag that IWPR estimates that restrictions placed on abortion access cost the United States an average of $173 billion per year. And this is even before the full effects of the Dobbs decision can be felt. And I'll just say too that, we're in a clarion call moment. It's important for all of us working on any aspect of women's rights issues to also link it to the issue of abortion care, because it impacts so many of us. And if it's not impacting you as an individual, it's impacting somebody you know. Everyone loves someone who has had an abortion. So this is really an issue that all of us should be fighting for.
Thank you. Before I ask this next question, I just want to note that this will be my last question before we hand it over to you all for Q&A. I want to follow up on the previous question and ask Jocelyn and Dr. Taylor, given your current and past work, could you each talk about the effects of abortion access on economic outcomes for Black women, particularly Black mothers, since we know that the majority of women getting abortions are already parents? And then could you also talk about the other communities that tend to struggle with healthcare in general, healthcare access in general, like low-income populations and rural populations as well?
Sure, I'll start. Thanks for the question. I think one of the many fallacies in the Dobbs decision is really something that Jamila alluded to, which is this notion that somehow you can eliminate access to abortion care and somehow just pull it out and it won't affect anything else. That it's, it's just one thing. You eliminate it. And, Justice Alito very intentionally tried to disregard all of the important data and research that Jamila already referenced in an effort to try to really minimize the far-reaching impact of the decision. And if you look at the impact on women and anybody who gives birth writ large, they're enormous. If you drill down and look at specific groups of women like Black women, it really becomes clearer. We have research that estimates, 6 million Black women will be impacted by the inability to access abortion. When you look more broadly and really understand that in context, what you have to pay attention to is that Black moms are more likely than any other group of mothers to be breadwinners. More than 80% of those moms, Black moms, are either co-primary or sole breadwinners in their families. That's CAP research. So when you think about the economic consequences of not being able to control your own fertility and handing over that responsibility to somebody else, it really becomes clearer when you start totaling what does it really cost to raise a child. Like there's research that will tell you it costs X hundred thousands of dollars to raise a child to the age of 17, but even that research doesn't really fully capture the amount of money that is required just to ensure that you have your kid and you have a stable life and it's the health and well-being. So there are those costs. But it is also true that one of the after effects of Dobbs is that it has wreaked havoc with the healthcare system. There are folks who are living in states where they can no longer access regular OBGYN care. They can't get access to other services. What if they are pregnant and they have an emergency? That's part of what we are seeing with all of these cases. And those have a disproportionate effect on women of color, low-income women, and Black women. And if you put it into the context of the maternal health, then you really get a clearer picture because we know from research, including CAP research, including IWPR research, including partnership research, that talks about disproportionately high rates of maternal morbidity for Black women. They are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy, at some point during their pregnancy connected to their maternal health. That is unacceptable. Right. But all of that is connected to an inability to control sort of your body and making a decision about your health. That has not only economic effects, but it has life or death consequences for families. There's research that says, there are already those disproportionate effects. There's the expectation that Black maternal morbidity will rise. Maternal morbidity is likely to rise by almost a quarter post-Dobbs, and I think it's closer to 40%, like 39% for Black women. Those are the effects of Dobbs. And those are the effects of, I think, an irresponsible Supreme Court that was really unwilling to pay any attention to the research that we know, not speculative, the stuff that we knew about what the after effects would be. And so that is something I think is critical for us all to be aware of in terms of really thinking about what does it mean to actually have an economy that's working for everybody.
Yeah, and want to follow up on everything Jocelyn said so eloquently about this issue, and just want to drive the point about the maternal mortality crisis in this country. The stats are clear, but at the same time, I think we cannot overstate the fact that what is going to happen as a result of Dobbs is that our maternal mortality crisis is going to become even worse. Right. And advocates are starting to make those connections. I will say that for far too long, those of us folks working in maternal health were working in silos away from the reproductive justice and rights movement for a really long time. And now it's really clear that we have to do more to make those connections because we know the impact that it's going to have. And then also to mention, Jocelyn mentioned that in some states, the OBGYNs are moving out of states with, restrictive abortion laws. So states like Texas, Florida, and Idaho, these are some trends that we're seeing. And the fact is that this is also contributing to maternity care deserts, right? These are places where these OBGYNs are providing abortion care, but they're also providing care for women who want to continue with their pregnancies. And so again, this is another result of, the Dobbs decision that we're going to see it impacting pregnant people that would like to continue with their pregnancies. And then I think also too, it's important to state here, because the question is in the context of Black women, Black women are already dealing with multiple oppressions in American society, right? And so when we think about the likelihood of having a poor maternal health outcome if they continue on with their pregnancy, cannot get access to an abortion if they would like to terminate. Also dealing with racism and discrimination on a daily basis. That in turn leads to weathering. And, their likelihood of living with, poor health outcomes across the board, poor health conditions. All of these things are also directly linked to their economic security, their ability to show up at work, to have mental health, when they show up in those jobs, to support the families that they already have, being breadwinners. A lot of times as breadwinners, they're supporting their immediate family, but also their extended family as well. And so I think we can't overstate the impact that Dobbs is going to have, the spillover effects, particularly on Black women and Black families. And then the last thing I'll say too is that the same states with the most restrictive abortion laws don't have laws in place to support women and families, to support the children and families that they already have, right? So these are the same states that lack access to paid leave, pay equity policies. They lack universal childcare, affordable housing. They also don't support access to contraception. So all of these things, again, will have a ripple effect when it comes to this issue.
I also just think there are so many other non-medical costs when you live in a rural area or you are low income that, we're also baking into these models, and it's just everything adds up so much. I want to go to audience questions. If we could maybe take two at the time and then answer just to stay on track. Let's start with Lily from the. Are we starting with a?
Yeah, so we'll start with some online questions.
Okay.
So one great question that came in from Michelle online. Do we have sufficient data and effective policy options on the role of domestic or intimate partner violence on gender equity in the economy?
So before I worked at Equal Rights Advocates, I was the president and CEO of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And it's interesting that we talked about the sort of separation of different gender justice movements. I think that in the past, before the COVID, there was certainly more of a segregation of folks who are working on pay equity and pay parity and domestic violence. And I think the pandemic really showed us that the real intersection of those issues and the true, economic costs of domestic violence. So I just want to commend organizations to the person who's asking the questions, look at organizations like the Hotline or the National Network to End Domestic Violence. In particular, NNEDV has an economic justice department because of the huge impact that it causes women. And it's also intersectional. It pushes women out of the workplace. It diminishes their, often a symptom of abuse. One of the factors in abuse is sabotaging economic opportunities, cutting up clothes, beating up someone before an interview. There's a ripple effect and a multi-pronged problem. And so one of the economic justice is a lifeline for survivors, and abusers know that. And so if you can't have independent income, if you can't hold down a job because of the abuse, you can't escape to safety. And we've seen some progress with policies on, to address things like, look at the paid leave movement. They have integrated paid safe days as well. That's just one example about how the movements are now working together, recognizing the impact of economic justice policies in creating economic security and therefore long-term safety for survivors.
Great, thank you. Another question from online. As our population ages, older women are becoming a larger portion of the workforce. We know that older women face the impacts of both sex and age discrimination at the same time, often compounding and amplifying each other. Do you think policymakers have done a good job addressing the concerns of older women, and what else needs to be done to build their economic security?
Well, my short answer is no. They haven't done enough. I mean, I think policymakers haven't done enough to address the needs of women, generally speaking. So, and that's particularly true for older women. I think some of the things that we've already spoken about, I think are even more true for older women when you understand sort of the role that they're often playing in their families. They are still doing caregiving. They themselves may have their own self-care needs. They're more likely, I think, to be relying on things like Social Security. They don't have the same types of assets and income as their male counterparts, in part because of the data that Emily pointed to. They're less likely, because they've been paid less their entire lives, they've lost money over the course of their careers. And so they are less likely to have the pensions of the same size as their counterpart, but yet they live longer than men. So there's a lot that's happening to them economically. And are we prepared for it? Have we done all the investments? No, there's more that we can do, certainly around caregiving supports, the ability to, self-care supports, so that they're not spending all their money for home care and other sorts of things as they age, but also things around, boosting wages so that their wages are higher, financial literacy and all of the things that folks need just to know better about how to manage their money, investing in women-owned businesses, because they're, I think, the source of the largest growth of small businesses. And that's also a way of building and accumulating wealth. There are a range of things that can be done around both the racial and gender wealth gap in terms of enabling folks to both acquire more assets and retain them over time. Like, all of those things help a number of folks, but they help older women in particular, and just giving them more financial support. And I think just as we silo women in our policy making, we often forget about older women completely. Right? Like we don't do really anything for them, and just hope that they, somehow miraculously make it on their own. So I think the answer is to start with centering them in the conversation, right?
And I would just add that that our laws don't do a great job in protecting against discrimination based on intersecting identities. And so when you're talking about the ways in which age discrimination and sex discrimination interact, our legal protections are a little muddy and blurry, which is part of the problem. I would also, I guess, affirm what Jocelyn is saying, that so many of the things that we've talked about today about what do you need to create gender equity in the workplace and economic security for women hit at different moments in the lifespan, and thus add up so that those losses, those gaps, build on each other and really show up in age. It's one reason why the wage gap is bigger for older women than for younger women. It's in part because the small difference in the raise that you got in your 20s gets bigger and bigger if you just get the same percentage every year. It is because you didn't have access to affordable childcare when your kids were little. And so you either had to have a spell out of the workplace entirely, or were spending tremendous amounts of money that you weren't able to save, that shows up in the assets and wealth that are available to you or not available to you at retirement. And so looking at these pieces and how they intersect across the lifespan, I think is also very much part of the answer.
One last point to that I wanted to add to is just the issue around retirement security. And, and I'm, looking at this for my own mother, and the fact that, because women are earning less, throughout their career, and then by the time it's time for them to retire, whatever benefits they're getting for retirement is not adequate, to be able to support them, not to mention, the cost of long-term care and other healthcare is more expensive as you age. And so I think we also need to bring that into the conversation when we're talking about women that are part of the aging community. And we sort of see, again, as with anything, the disparities are even wider when we compare, older Black women to white women.
We have time for one last question.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the conversation around the role of occupational segregation in the gender pay gap and thinking about and recruiting women into these historically male-dominated fields. There's some evidence that occupations that have become more female over time have been in turn seen their relative pay go down. I'm thinking about medical specialties like obstetrics and pediatrics, but also fields like HR or marketing. Just to say that I guess it's not a silver bullet and that there's some trade-offs. And I'm curious about the panel's thoughts on recruiting men into historically female-dominated fields like teaching to generate some solidarity across the genders around increasing pay for jobs that we know support our society. And I guess just more broadly, what your thoughts are on how we can pull men into this conversation and kind of raise our collective stakes that we attach to this.
Happy to.
No. Well, I mean, the only thing I was going to say is that, I think, thank you for lifting up that data. I think both things are true. Like when the occupation becomes more female, the wages go down. When the occupation becomes more male, the wages go up. So I am all for inclusion in a variety of ways to get more men into traditionally female occupations and more women into traditionally male occupations. But I completely agree with you that that's only a piece of the puzzle. Like at the end of the day, part of what's happening is that people devalue the work that women do. And they think that they can pay women less because they think women's work is less worthy of being compensated. That is a different type of a problem. So you have to be clear about what the problem is you're trying to fix, which is an attitude, a stereotype, a culture that has, for decades, hundreds of years, said that women do work that somehow is less valuable. And you have to be intentional about correcting that problem, along with making sure that folks can access whatever jobs they want. So I think it's less about what the right balance is, right? Like at the end of the day, I think people should, work in whatever job they want, but they also should not be subject to discrimination or being viewed as, because it's a Black woman or a Latina or, whatever person, that somehow their work doesn't deserve to be compensated at the same level. So I think we have to be clear about what the problem is. And the last thing I'd say, and then we have to be clear about what the solutions are. And so some of the solutions are the things we talked about how you get folks into, let's say, traditionally male occupations. But some of the solutions are also about making sure that you have enough money going to enforcement agencies to make sure that they're actually enforcing anti-discrimination protections that are being used to pay folks unfairly. Both things have to happen. And if you miss one, then you're not probably going to fix it in the way that you want.
Yeah, I echo everything Jocelyn said. I think that it's here. The sad fact is that wherever women work in male-dominated or female-dominated industries, they are undervalued and underpaid. And it is also true that, as men enter occupations, the wages can go up, but in male-dominated fields, where there are in virtually all fields, and I'm thanking IWPR for their fabulous research. If you look at female-dominated fields and male-dominated fields, women still make less than men. So even if you are recruiting men into teaching, the men are making more than the women, even if all wages go up. So we certainly have a problem about that. And I think that, again, it goes to what Jocelyn says. It means that we need more protections that are more exacting to the problems. And we've learned a lot since the laws were passed, the federal laws were passed in 1963 and 1964. They have essentially not been, there have been with a few exceptions, they've essentially not been updated, but we've learned a lot more about how discrimination operates in the workforce. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is there's a federal bill called the Fair Pay Act, which would require equal pay for the same or similar work. And that combined with some of these other protections that we've talked about would certainly help a great deal. So if you look at, and last thing I'll say is like going back to childcare, we pay more in this country for people who are watching cars than watching kids, meaning like parking lot attendants can make more than people who are watching children. And that's not going to be solved by necessarily equal pay for equal work. So we need this panoply of laws that eventually then that people will be less accepting of the biases that are subjective, that creep in part because the laws will address them, but also because they will see the change that comes when these laws are passed.
And I would just throw in our last moments that I think you're right, that bringing men into female-dominated occupations is not the whole solution, but is a piece of sort of unlocking the racialized gender stereotypes that often drives pay down in those fields. And so part of the answer is meaningful public investment in things like care jobs and teaching jobs so that those jobs are attractive to people who have more marketplace options like men. And also ensuring that there are strong protections on workers' rights to organize, because we know that unions build solidarity. We know that in unionized workplaces, not only are wages higher for women, but they are more equal for a variety of reasons. One big one being that pay is more likely to be set in really objective and clear and transparent ways. And so thinking of all those pieces together about making public investments in the care jobs and the other jobs that we all rely on to make our lives and our economy work, and ensuring that workers can come together in those jobs to negotiate, to bargain. I think those are part of the solution to sort of ending the over-concentration of women and women of color in jobs in ways that mirror and perpetuate the undervaluing of those jobs.
So as we've heard today, I want to wrap us up because I know folks are in back-to-back events today. It's clear that women are the ones driving the economy, and it's also clear that we are a dominant voting bloc, and we aren't a special interest group or a niche voting bloc. And we need policymakers to support us through legislation that continues that momentum. The Playbook for the Advancement of Women in the Economy provides policymakers with the blueprint to do just that. You all can find that at americanprogress.org. It should be on our home webpage for a few days at least. And you can rewatch this event if you would like to online at americanprogress.org/events. I thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the beautiful weather that we're having today. Thank you.
That's great.